That's where weather
right.
hits all of us. It's a fundamental driver of consumer behavior. It sits below price. It sits below fashion. At the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, we make our decisions about what we're going to do for the day or for tomorrow, or increasingly even for next week as the forecast gets better, based on what that forecast is telling us.
Welcome to Content Kingdom. This is your backstage pass to the people, tools, and the trends shaping the future of content marketing.
Content kings, content queens, content killers. This is your host, David G. Ewing, and we have a very special episode of Content Kingdom today. I'm very excited. There is as many of you know, I'm a very big history buff, and there's a cool movie coming out called Pressure with Brendan Fraser, and it's all about Dwight Eisenhower and his weatherman, Captain James Stagg, and they have to make a decision. Do they launch D-Day or not launch D-Day? And so the movie is about the 72 hours before D-Day and what needs to happen. And it's a really cool movie. And I was talking to producer Lee about what could we do to tie into the movie, and he found one of the most interesting people I've ever met, Paul Walsh, from G2 Weather Intelligence, and we just had to have him on the podcast today because Paul, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. We're going to talk about the movie Pressure, which is coming out, but we're also going to talk about real life decisions that people have to make with weather and content and marketing, which is like your zone, right, man?
It's my wheelhouse. Yeah. I'm kind of a unicorn isn't the right word. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I got a very, very narrow niche.
And, that's what Content Kingdom's all about is, we kind of want to explore every asset, nook and cranny of content. And this is definitely one that was kind of a cool idea. So you want to hear a funny story? Do you remember the movie Titanic when that came out?
Of course.
So I was standing in line. I think I was in college at the time. I'm standing in line, and there's these 12 or 14-year-old kids in front of me, and they're in Boston, and they're like, yeah, what do you want to see? And one of them's in line. He goes, I don't know. Why don't we go see Titanic? And the other one goes, nah, I don't want to see a movie about a ship that sinks. And the first kid looks at him stunned and goes, it sinks? Thanks for ruining it, jerk. And the whole place went nuts. Everybody was laughing. And so I just bring that up. I tell that story because we're going to talk about what actually happened on D-Day. So if you don't know the story, stop listening right now, because there will be spoilers, because guess what? It's not new news, right? It's about a ship that sinks. It's about a landing and a weather decision. So but if you were really, really hoping to just, get the exciting conclusion of Pressure, you probably shouldn't listen to this episode because there will be spoilers. With that, Paul, you got into weather, and you were telling me during the pre-show that you were a member of the 101st Airborne. So why don't we start there with, when Paul was a child and decided he got interested in weather, what's the story there, man? How did that happen?
Well, I'll keep it short because it can be a very long story. So I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version for those of the boomers that understand that reference. I joined the Air Force, believe it or not, U.S. Air Force, when I was 16 years old.
You could do
19, that? Yes, you can, but I didn't join until I turned 17. So in high school, November 1977. So now I'm dating myself, but who cares?
Yeah. I was one, dude.
Yeah. I literally joined the same day that Jimmy Carter was elected president. I just turned 16, actually.
All right.
When you join the Air Force, you take an aptitude test. So I took an aptitude test. It's called ASVAB. I'm not sure what that acronym stands for anymore, but I took it. Yep. And I qualified for about 4 different jobs. One of them was to be a fireman. I had a friend who had already joined the Air Force, and he told me that, and they made him a fireman. And he said, all we ever do is sit around and wash trucks and, pick up stuff, because there's not that many fires on Air Force bases.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The other opportunity was for a radio operator. And then the other opportunity was for a weather specialist. So I didn't know what a weather specialist was, but I'd seen this movie called No Time for Sergeants, where these funny guys are flying an airplane and they're talking on the radio, and it looked cool. So I said, I'll be a radio operator. And the person looked it up and they said, oh, I'm sorry, that job is all filled. So there's only one job left. weather specialist. I had no idea what a weather specialist was, but I was 16 years old. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. So I said, okay, I'll do it. It wasn't until a year later when I actually went to basic training, made it through basic training. The drill instructor had a little session with everybody and said, okay, you guys have all passed. You're all going to technical training. Ask me questions about what it is that you're going to be doing. And I said, I'm going to be a weather specialist. What's that? And he said, I don't know. As it turns out, what a weather specialist does in the Air Force in those days was basically something called a weather observer, where you would literally, as it sounds, observe the weather, take readings, temperature readings, plot maps. This is in the 70s, so there was no such thing as the internet, and everything was teletypes and fax machines and things like that, and hand-plotted maps. So that's how I ended up in the weather field.
Okay.
100 years ago. There's a lot of people out in the weather space, like former colleagues of mine on the Weather Channel, who had some sort of formative experience with a tornado or a hurricane that made them want to be a weather person. I just kind of landed there by mistake.
Okay.
But well, as it turned out, I kind of enjoyed it. Once I made it through, I did my first enlistment. Like what happens to many people, when you do your first enlistment, or many of my friends, I met somebody, I got married, I fell in love, or vice versa, had kids. And so at the end of the enlistment, it was like, well, what do I do now? I didn't have obviously a college degree or anything. I just had this experience. So I re-enlisted. And that ended up becoming a 20-year career in the Air Force.
Okay.
And the natural progression in the Air Force is you move, in those days, you would move from a weather observer. So think of it almost like an apprenticeship. So I spent 5 years as a weather observer. And then I went to weather forecaster school, which is a very difficult, at the time, about a 6-month sort of crash course on how to be a weather forecaster. And I became a weather forecaster. So that's how I ended up, as an operational weather forecaster, and sort of did a whole career in the Air Force. And I finished my Air Force engagement or tour and retired, and then joined the private sector, which is how I sort of ended up doing this weird stuff I do now with consumer business, retailers, CPG, healthcare, and did a pretty interesting stint at the Weather Channel, or the Weather Company, I should say, as well as IBM after we were acquired.
Nice. So now let's dive into the part that I think is going to be interesting for marketers. Although we could do a whole episode, and I would love to do one about what you did with weather and how that works. But I think, at a high level, anyone listening to this is going to say, well, I get that if you're in the military and you're jumping out of a helicopter, or you're flying a helicopter, or you're jumping out of a plane, or whatever you're doing, like the weather has a huge impact, right? But now we're talking about business and consumers and retail. And, to me, it's not quite as clear. Nobody's jumping out of a perfectly good airplane to go buy things at Walmart, right? So walk me through that. Like, why does the weather matter to marketers and retail and other industries?
Are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? A sort of hierarchy of needs that starts with the very bottom with the survival and safety needs.
Yeah,
that's where weather hits.
Shelter.
That's where weather hits all of us. All of us, you, me. I mean, it's raining outside right now, and I'm obviously not outside. I'm in here talking to you, which is awesome. But it's a fundamental driver of consumer behavior. It sits below price. It sits below fashion. It fits below, many of the other things that we think about, self-actualization and all that stuff. At the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, we make our decisions about what we're going to do in a large part, in a larger part than I think we think about on a day-to-day basis, because we're mammals and it's like hardwired into us. But we make our decisions about what we're going to do for the day or for tomorrow, or increasingly even for next week as the forecast gets better, based on what that forecast is telling us. And then we're making decisions in our mind about, okay, shoot, it's going to rain this weekend. Rather than go to the park and have a picnic, let's go do something indoors. Or, oh, we got to go shopping this week. It's going to be really cold next week. Let's buy some firewood or something, or let's change the barbecue or barbecuing plans for the weekend. So it's a fundamental driver of human behavior. It's just call it what it is, a fundamental driver of human behavior. But the really, really interesting and the really valuable thing about that is it is extremely measurable. especially on the retail side. Or the impact is measurable. How is it measurable? You combine weather data, historical weather data with, let's say, historical point of sale data. And let's measure how the weather is impacting fleece sales in California versus how the weather is impacting fleece sales in Georgia or in Minnesota. And as it turns out, the impact of weather on sales of seasonal products, any seasonal product, which makes a big piece of the assortment of what retailers are selling and what CPG manufacturers are making, is very, very measurable, as I mentioned before, but it's also very local. The definition of you're in Austin.
I'm in Austin.
So
Texas,
what you see as a cool day in the summertime might be 95, but you take that same 95 and you put it in Seattle, and people are heading to the emergency room, from heat exhaustion because they don't have air conditioners, or they're just not acclimated to that. So that means that on any given day and any given time, that undergirding sort of consumer driver, that base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is driving different behaviors. If you're a marketer and you understand how that weather is or will be, and will be is important here because of the fact that weather forecasts are ubiquitous and we all look at the weather forecast every day, and that shapes our behavior. Then you can do things like change up the way that you are advertising or the content that you're advertising, or maybe not advertise because it's, I'm outside of Philly right now. It's on my watch, it's 62 degrees and raining. And so I'm going to be different. I'm behaving differently today, which I am for sure, than I was yesterday. Well, you can now know that in a way that's not totally creepy. You can know that sort of from a machine learning or an analytical way, and then you can predict what I'm going to be wanting and needing next week. I've got the Substack called G2 Weather Intelligence, to give myself a little bit of a plug there. And one of my topics, every Monday I put out a post for what the forecast is going to be for the next 3 to 4 week period. And right now that overlays Memorial Day weekend. And I'm very bullish on Memorial Day weekend for the second half of May. The reason is because across the East, it's abnormally cold and rainy. Not everywhere, but that's the general trend. But by the time we get into the week before Memorial Day, it's going to turn abnormally warmer than normal. And so that means that there's going to be this sort of pent-up demand outbreak. Again, for those of us in the East who have been sort of going through this like relatively cool sort of spring. Knowing that in advance, marketers can start thinking about where they're going to fire ads, or where they shouldn't, but like they shouldn't be firing barbecue ads today in this area. And all of that can be done now programmatically. All of that can be done very, very quickly. And what's going on now in the world around AI is two things. One, increasingly AI is being used to make weather forecasts. And the weather forecasts that AI is generating are almost comparable to what the physics models are actually pushing out. But also because AI is running them, they can be done a lot cheaper. So the cost of that data is going to be coming down dramatically. And then when you overlay that on that agentic AI systems, that can actually take in that data. They can understand what that data means for a specific cohort of people, a specific location or region, or somewhere down the road where they've got like loyalty data. They can know what that means for me specifically, and start to serve up ads and start to serve up promotions that align exactly with what I'm going to be wanting and needing, and even feeling, because there's an emotional impact to the weather as well. So it's really a super cool. And it's something, this is what I did when I was with Weather Company. I was hired to start an analytics business. Weather Company is the parent, or was the parent, of the Weather Channel. And so we developed an application called Weather Effects, which was basically for marketers, and it was leveraged by agencies to basically set up those kind of triggers and do it at scale. So it was super cool. And it all relates back to, again, to take this back to my military background, and the term of art, at least that I use, and is weather intelligence, which is what G2 means in the military. G2 is weather intelligence. In fact, I'm kind of doing I'm doing a little bit of what Donald Trump calls the weave here. So forgive me.
I'm about to start pulling apart your weave, but go ahead, finish your weave, man. Let's do it.
All right. Anyway, the G2 is intelligence and military. It's what, when Stagg was giving the forecast to Eisenhower, he was giving them the G2. He was giving them the G2 weather. And when I was with 101st, literally when we were in the Tactical Operations Center, which is where the CEO, but the commanding general sits, and we would do briefings twice a day. And it would always start with G2 weather. G2 weather, you're up first. They'd look at the weather first, and then plans come off of that. And so instead of firing an advertisement, they'd be launching UH-60s and AH-64s into Iraq in that instance.
Got it.
That's how it all sort of ties back together.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful, Paul. All right. So let's pull apart a couple of different things here, because there's a lot to unpack in that opening statement. So the first thing is going back to the Maslow hierarchy of needs. I get it. And you made an assertion that I think is fairly bold, but I'm going to back you up on this one. And that is that weather matters more than price. And anyone who has ever gone to San Francisco for the first time thinking, oh, it's California, it's going to be really nice. You go to San Francisco and it's freezing cold, and you're sitting at the wharf, and there's like 4 dudes selling fleeces and hoodies.
Yes.
And, if a hoodie normally costs like $50, these guys are selling it for $125. And there's a line, right? People are like, I need a hoodie so bad because they're freezing cold. And they will just buy the hoodie at 2x the price, right? So,
correct.
So that I buy that. I'll buy that the price is there. What I would like to talk about next, though, is if you are a marketer and you've got this weather data that you talked about, right? One of the tricks is, how actionable is it at the local level? And then if you're a CMO and you're like running a larger organization, like if you are running like a national chain of some kind, how to scale it. So let's break this down into a couple of questions. First, let's talk locally. I'm a store manager, right? And I've got one store. So I've got one weather report I got to worry about. And it's springtime, right? Well, because it's springtime right now. And I did read your G2 Substack, and it was pretty cool. Though I saw the one with your dog on the table with the
Benji.
pergola above. And that looked great. And so your point there in that article was pretty interesting, which was you were bullish on the local weather conditions in Pennsylvania. So let's say that I'm a store manager in your region, right? In PA. How do I use the data that you're telling me, and what would I practically change if I was running a store? And you could pick any kind of store you want. So anything from hardware to retail clothing to anything else. Like what do I do differently if I've got weather data?
The way that we did it when I was at Weather Company, and I'm sure it's way more sophisticated now because I've been gone. We were acquired by IBM, and I left IBM years ago, but it was mostly programmatically.
Okay.
And so they had a programmatic system. So that wasn't really for a store manager. That was for a much larger advertiser that would be doing this at a local
Well,
way.
that'd be even greater. Like, tell me about that. Yeah.
Well, basically what we did, and they still do now, as far as I know, it was we created weather indexes that basically correlate to different sort of consumer behavior, and then hardwired that into a programmatic system that the weather company developed and built. And, then they would sell that, for a higher CPM to advertisers, basically a premium advertisement. And the ads would only run at the right time, in the right place.
Got it.
With the right message. That old saying, I forget who said it. I know that I'm wasting 50% of my money on advertising, but I don't know which 50%. So in this case, it's kind of taken out the 50% that you don't know what you're spending the advertising on, because if you're advertising when it's raining and 50 degrees in, Pennsylvania, your ad dollars are basically, getting burned up in a fire pit.
Got it. So it's not so easy as just.
Oh, right.
It's not so easy as just like looking at weather patterns and then saying that there's a correlation to consumer patterns. It really is going to affect, it's got to be about your goods, right? So if you have cold weather goods are great in cold weather, right? If you have,
correct,
fun in the sun goods, you're going to need fun in the sun weather, I guess, in order to do that. Because people are kind of reacting a little bit to their their weather conditions is what I'm hearing you say, right?
The interesting thing is that there's obvious things like umbrellas or jackets, but when you really get into the data and you start looking at how the weather influences consumer behavior, there's a lot of things that are sort of counterintuitive. That makes sense after the fact, but you don't really think about it on a day-to-day basis. One example of that is how the weather forecast shapes behavior. Years ago, I worked with a large grocer that was based in Florida. It's probably been long enough. I could probably say the name of them, but I won't, just so we don't get ourselves in trouble. But their business problem wasn't the weather; it was the weather forecast. Every time the weather forecast, and during hurricane season, so when there would be a what they call the cone of uncertainty was going to be coming over their stores, they would stock out of prepared chicken. I don't know why. People basically dashing over to get prepared chicken, I guess worried about they were going to lose power. So the use case there was that this is before I was with Weather Company / Channel. We were predicting where we thought the Weather Channel was going to deploy their talent. Because when Jim Cantore shows up, at a local market, everybody panics and they run to the grocery store. They wanted to have a day or two lead time so that they could make sure that they were getting their inventory of prepared chicken coming. And the thing that stood out to me about that is that the customer said this, and I've repeated this 100 times, but I still like the line. He said, if you're ever wrong, and he said this in this very deep sort of Southern accent, there's going to be a lot of needlessly killed chickens. There's a great example, a quick one from Walmart. And Walmart was very public about this, and it was many, many years ago. And what they found was that whenever there was a hurricane threat, not a hurricane threat, they would stock out of strawberry Pop-Tarts. That wouldn't be something you would think of automatically, but then again, it's got a half-life of 20 years. And so if you're worried about losing power, you go buy all the strawberry Pop-Tarts. And so they made sure that when there was a prediction of a hurricane, that they were well inventoried with strawberry Pop-Tarts. And then don't advertise strawberry Pop-Tarts, because why waste the money when Mother Nature is going to be doing the work for you?
Now that's a pretty interesting insight too. Somebody at Oracle told me that story once, and they had embellished that story. Maybe it was apocryphal. They said it was beer and Pop-Tarts. So I don't know if that's the case.
Well, beer goes without saying, actually.
That's just
also
a steady
beans and
demand,
bullets.
always on high. Yeah. So any weather, it doesn't matter. So I guess if you're in alcohol sales, weather doesn't matter because it's always on high, right? So, no kidding. Okay. So that's those are some pretty interesting stories about that. But can you tell me about maybe when you think about the most counterintuitive things about how weather affects consumer behavior, what's something that really has surprised you?
Oh gosh. I got to think about this now. I've done so much now in a prior life. Here's one. This is working with a very large department store retailer in the UK. We basically did analysis of almost all their product categories. It's a really big deal. I won't even mention the name of the company, but it was probably more than 15 years ago. And we looked at all their different product categories. And one of the things that we found was that there was a seasonality between black women's underwear, I think thong underwear, and white thong underwear. Because apparently what they told us, and what do I know about thong underwear, is that women would switch over to like white pants when it became spring versus black pants. And apparently if you're wearing black thong underwear with white pants, it kind of shows up. And so there was a sort of seasonality to that, which I wouldn't have thought of before. And by understanding what that trigger temperature is in, say, London, that all of a sudden makes it feel like spring. And maybe that's 60 degrees as opposed to where you live. It may need to be 75 or 80. That was that's when they needed to be well inventoried with white underwear versus the black underwear. That was like one of the most counterintuitive, and I just like the story because we're talking about thong underwear and black versus white, and having these conversations with a bunch of young buyers who were, by the way, dead serious about it. This is
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's business, it's money, right? I mean, it's just a
Exactly.
product, and so to them, it's just a product. So that's great. Well, okay, so all right, so those are some of the things. Now, if you're taking a step back and you're looking at some of the bigger trends, right? If you're a nationwide CMO, I know it's going to be business dependent, but you know, you mentioned AI and how we can use AI weather forecasts to get more agentic and more programmatic. What are some of like kind of the frontiers right now where because of these new capabilities, we can do things with weather data that we couldn't do before? What comes to mind for you?
Great question, and I'm working on a whole series of articles on that exactly. So it's actually a pretty big topic. But if you think about it from a retail perspective, there's there's a whole bunch of different, because of the fact that weather is so foundational, and it is basically the first thing that's going to be driving consumer intent, consumer behavior, consumer emotions. It's something that should be sort of hardwired into all of the sort of different components of a retail plan, starting with planning. So retailers today are planning for holiday 2026. They've got to make their buy quantities, et cetera, et cetera. We're coming off of a very cold, relatively cold winter in the East. Therefore, they had a very strong season for selling seasonal goods. If you simply use a return to normal, which is the best prediction you can get for the season for next year, it's pretty clear that there's going to be a lower, what we call weather-driven demand for seasonal product categories. Think of jackets or long underwear. So right now they should be thinking about taking down their plans for next year relative to last year on a year-over-year basis. So de-weatherizing their historical plan. Once you get in season where you can start to see the whites of their eyes in terms of how the weather is likely to change, you can start doing things differently as it relates to your actual distribution plans. Once you get even closer in, and you can also start to think from a marketing perspective of what are going to be the major themes for these categories. Think of outerwear, et cetera. Understanding that the season might be a little weaker this following year, so you might need to spend more actually to be able to get the same level of demand you got the year before, because you're going to have a deficit. You're not going to have as much of a tailwind of the weather driving demand. So there's a whole sort of marketing plan. And once you get in season, of course, that's when you start to fire off the marketing so that you're not spending when it's 65 degrees in December in New York City, but you're spending huge, like 3 or 4 days before that day where the 65 goes to 30. So you're basically, you're doubling down. So you're optimizing your spend. Staffing is a whole nother issue. You can look at forecasts, far enough in advance if you've done the analytics and you know how many servers you need in a restaurant when it's raining on a Saturday and Sunday. You can then cut back on your spend from a staffing perspective. And so it's the entire sort of life cycle that I'm advocating that retailers need to think about. They need to completely think differently about the way that they use what has typically been a commodity. We buy weather data, we look at the weather data, somebody looks at it and says, oh, I remember what happened the last time this occurred. We did this, this, and that. Whereas now, that's where the agentic sits in. It says, it's going to look at the weather patterns. It's going to understand how that shaped consumer behavior in the past. It's going to help you make a better decision or systemically make a scalable decision. And then after the fact, it'll go back and see if that worked. If it didn't, it will learn from that. So next time it gets even better. So it's has a potential to completely revolutionize the way that retailers plan and execute their business by no longer ignoring that one measurable, forecastable element that has, I would argue, not every day, but certainly during key periods, the biggest impact on sort of the ebb and the flow of consumer demand out there. So if you put all of that together, all of a sudden you are servicing your customers better, you're doing it more profitably, and you're helping people deal with weather conditions that are increasingly volatile, and you're actually contributing to you're helping your customers be more resilient by making sure you have the right product at the right time, that your customers know you have the right product at the right time. You don't have too much of that product, so you're actually saving from a margin perspective because you're not having to mark it down afterwards. So that's sort of the nirvana. But the unlock, and I've been talking about this for more than 20 years since I left the Air Force. The unlock is AI. The unlock is the ability to get those weather forecasts that are increasingly accurate and increasingly not regionalized, but hyper-local. And then also, and this is the big piece, the agentics that allow you to scale those decisions and execute those decisions. So what happened historically, and I've been in sort of the weather vendor seat before, and by and large, retailers, CPG companies, healthcare companies, they'll buy weather data. It's an API, or it's a really fancy dashboard with all the bells and whistles, and probably 80% of the stuff they never even look at or even understand what they're looking for. But at the end of the day, it requires somebody to look at it and make a decision. Well, what if that person that's using it's made that decision and really knows how to use it, leaves and goes somewhere else? It's gone, and somebody else has to learn it. So that's the AI component to that, and that's the part that I think is going to just completely change the game.
Well, it makes me wonder about something, and I'd be surprised if anybody had any of this data, but maybe you have a thought on it or a hypothesis. Is we talked about the consumer purchase behavior, right? I might go to the store, I might buy a product, I might be less price sensitive, I might be more price sensitive, and I got a stock for it based on weather. The thing that you mentioned, though, about whether I should dial up my advertising or dial it down, the part I'm interested in next is, does weather affect the medium for advertising? For example, do you know, or has anybody studied the idea that if it's rainy out, I'm more likely to be on my mobile phone, more receptive to text, or if it's hot out, I don't know, I'm more likely to be on Twitter, or so the effect of like our usage of social media and that social media channel, or an email channel, or some other channel. Does anybody know how the weather affects the channel?
I'm trying to remember. I think we did some of that when I was with a weather company, and I was hired as a VP of weather analytics. So we were sort of deep into that stuff. It's kind of a funny story. I spoke at an event in New York, and one of the things I had just done on my own, where you could map. You probably can still do this. Twitter mentions historically, and so I did a comparison that was kind of tongue in cheek, but I said, how many times do people use the word weather versus how many times do they use the word sex? And weather basically blew it away. So people are talking about the weather on social media way more than they're talking about sex. And the cool thing about it was that there's somebody in the audience that made like a cartoon, and of me, I'll send a copy to it. And under the caption was, "Weather is better than sex," per Paul Walsh. But if you think about this, back to the original discussion around the fact that it sits at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's sort of the foundational driver of our behavior, then everything we do, maybe not everything, maybe I'm overstating, but it certainly influences our emotions and our mood. It influences where we're going. And nowadays we're on social media wherever we go, probably more than we should be. And to the extent that the weather is shaping your mood, and the weather companies recently, I haven't read all of it, has done some research around the impact of the weather on emotions. And so that it impacts basically, the everything about how we sort of live our lives. Because at the end of the day, as I said before, we're all mammals, and we live, within this environment that is shaped by the ebbs and the flows of cold fronts and warm fronts and drought and all those other things. And the weather forecast, because it is so ubiquitous, and because it's right way more than it's wrong, we tend to believe it. And that's why and again, this is something I've been preaching for years as well. The weather forecast is, from a marketing perspective for sure, is actually probably more important than the actual weather, because it's setting the mindset for somebody. And it's getting people to think about, hey, what should I be doing tomorrow, the next day, the day after, or even next week? And that's when you want to be communicating with them with something that's going to align with what they're going to be wanting, needing, or even feeling based on the environment.
Got it. Okay. So that's more like the idea that it's Thursday and the weather forecast for the weekend is likely to be rainy. So people are maybe going to go to the movies more, or, they're going to do things based on the weather forecast and maybe buy those tickets now because because they think it's going to rain. Whether it actually is going to rain or not is kind of inconsequential. Movie ticket sales are going to go up based on Thursday's forecast. Is that kind of the idea? Okay.
Exactly right. And where the analytics comes in and where it becomes super important is that if the weather forecast for the weekend is for a 1/4 inch of rain and you live in Seattle, that likely will have little to no impact on consumers in Seattle. But if you overlay that exact forecast in Los Angeles, then people are going to be cocooning in their homes and they're going to have a completely different reaction. It's all local, just like politics. It's all local, the way that we react to the weather.
Got it.
It does impact elections as well, but that's a whole probably another segment.
Yeah. Let's so then let's go into a couple of spicier topics that on this. So one of the questions I have for you is the thought of climate change. And does climate change have longer term effects on any type of consumer behavior that you've seen?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the climate is changing. It's getting warmer, but it's getting warmer gradually. And so if you look back at like the last 30 years, you're going to see an upward slope. From a consumer perspective, that gradualness means that a cold day today in Philadelphia on whatever day today is, May 6th, may be a little bit warmer than it was 20 years ago. So we're acclimating to these changes. So we're always going to have winter. We're always going to have snow. And so it's not, it's such a long-term change that it doesn't have obvious impacts on us just as on a day-to-day from a consumer perspective, from a consumer demand perspective. But it does mean that smaller changes could have bigger impacts. So it's something, like I'll look at, changes from normal temperatures as sort of the drivers. So from a retail perspective, even if they're not using weather data and you're selling a seasonal product, by default, you're basically predicting the season because your sales will go up in the spring and then go down in the fall if you're selling a summer product category. The problem that they have is that it's a moving average. And so when spring starts this year is probably, or over the next few years, is going to be getting progressively earlier. And then winter starts is going to be getting progressively later. And so that's something you need to keep an eye on and sort of manage, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And can you think of a story where somebody didn't use weather data and then they started to adopt weather data and they got a huge ROI? Have you ever watched or seen any of that happen in your career?
Yes. Now, if I had thought about this before, I could have come up with some great examples. Here's one. This goes back to when I first joined Weather Company. I had basically developed a strategy that was sort of a bigger than big. It was what I told you about. We can, in fact, planning and distribution and pricing and markdown. But at the end of the day, the Weather Company was the Weather Channel was the primary driver of revenue. And so we focused on advertising. I forget what year this was. It would have been, I guess, 2012. There was a presidential, a Republican convention was being held in Tampa, Florida. I may not get the dates exactly right. It was around 2012. I had just got done. I had just got started there. And one of our advertisers was Duracell batteries. And, this is very early days. So it was kind of almost like a proof of concept for us. But it was clear from the weather models that there was going to be some kind of a tropical storm / hurricane activity that was going to be sort of moving into the Tampa area right when they're having the Republican convention. So I was working with, a sales guy that was sort of the representative for our ad business with Duracell. We connected with Duracell and we said, let's heavy up on Duracell batteries for this market, for this period, so that if in fact there is a hurricane threat, that you'll be able to capture that business. Long story short, it did. There was a tropical storm / hurricane that went right over the sort of the Republican convention, and their sales just went through the roof. They had enough inventory to meet that demand, and that was really sort of the trigger for us. That was like, wow, this actually really works.
Yeah.
And that led to investment and hiring a bunch of people way smarter than me that could actually build ad tech platforms, which, I don't actually do any work. I just come up with ideas.
Okay.
And so that was sort of a clear example of how right product, right place, right time, right messaging, and you basically get a 2x or 3x. I forget what the number was in terms of the actual sales. They would have gotten more sales anyway, but they actually
But they would have run out of stock.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
they sold more than they would have, and had the inventory to be able to meet that demand, which was obviously a lot because you had a bunch of political people in town, and it's like, oh crap, whom from all over the country, we got to get a battery for our flashlight.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And yeah, you can't sell to yesterday's consumer. You can't sell last night's hotel room. You can't do any of those things. So yeah, you have to have the stock at the right moment, at the right time. So that's beautiful. Paul, with G2 Weather Intelligence, you obviously create your own content. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit about some of the content you create and how that's been working for you.
Sure. So it's kind of a labor of love, really. I've been doing this for a couple of years and sort of experimenting with the messaging that I want to put out. And the messaging that I want to put out is really not what I just described, how there's this massive opportunity out there, but companies are moving too slow. Especially the retailers and CPG companies are buying weather data, but they're not really using it. So it's really, I really want to sort of educate them on how they can start thinking differently and doing it in a way that's independent. So I don't, I'm no longer with IBM or a weather company, or I was with Google for a short period of time. So I'm not selling a product. I'm just trying to educate folks on how all the stuff works. I'm also, when I was with weather company, I used to do segments on the Weather Channel relatively frequently. And then because we were owned by NBC, I would do CNBC and things like that. So I do know some, bookers and producers at those channels. So I get the word out that way as well. What I'm doing now is, as I mentioned before, and I'm just doing it right now, is this whole series on all of the ways that these companies should be thinking about how they leverage weather data beyond simply just paying for an API or buying a really fancy dashboard that somebody has to look at and make a decision, because that's the roadblock, is that it requires a human to make a decision that usually is based on gut and emotion, even though they're looking at data. And that's where I just see this big, hairy opportunity with AI. And so that's where I've been focused. And that's sort of the direction I'm going now. But it's been fun, using Substack, learning. And I don't have thousands and thousands of people that read me because I'm such a unique, I think the old saying, niche or be niched. I'm niched as I'm very niche.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your content is great. And I loved your Spring Outlook article that you just released. And so you're getting one more subscriber for me. What is the name of your Substack in case anybody would like to sign up who's listening?
It's G2 Weather Intelligence.
Okay. So search for G2 Weather Intelligence on Substack and they can listen to the great Paul Walsh.
Did you want to talk about pressure before we?
Yeah, I thought we would end with that. And
good. I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to. You mean I'm blabbing, so I don't want to. Take a ball.
No, not at all. But you just talked about the thing that I was going to tie into, which is the idea that one of the things in the trailer that they talk about is Captain James Stagg says, give me every bit of data that we have, because he wants to make a data-driven decision. And so I thought that would be kind of an interesting place to jump off there. Obviously they do make a decision to delay. Anyone who's seen Band of Brothers already knows that spoiler that, they did delay a day. Walk me through what you know about that. Like what were your thoughts on that, or what if you read about that?
Oh, I don't think I could read this.
There we go. The forecast for D-Day. Yeah. This
is the whole story on Stagg by a guy named John Ross, who I did a TV show with once on the Weather Channel. But so the and I've done many keynotes where I start telling the D-Day story, and it's really all about the fact that first of all, the Germans did not think there was going to be a landing because they thought the weather was going to be too bad. And the Allies had the edge there. And one of the, just to take you back just a step, I mentioned this with the 101st Airborne Division, but when I left the Air Force, I was hired by a company at the time called Strategic Weather Services. Strategic Weather Services was founded by a guy named Irving Crick. Irving Crick was the American meteorologist who was working with Stagg.
Oh,
And
wow.
he was a real character. In some ways, they had kind of a contentious relationship. And he's got whole books written about him as well. But he founded the company that I joined when I left the Air Force. And so I had that other sort of weird connection between the D-Day landing and the fact that I was with the 101st. And I always use that when I do my keynotes and things like that. But the reality is that the weather forecast was touch and go. They were looking at weather forecasts are getting from weather observations are getting from ships out in the North Atlantic. There was a famous, I can't remember the name of the weather station in Ireland where they saw the pressure starting to drop, which gave them that first indication that there could be a break in the weather and they would get this sort of weather window. But it was the one thing that sort of gave them that little bit of surprise that helped in terms of getting on the beach and basically being successful. But it was not, I've been reading a lot lately, on the sort of the I just read a whole three series book on the D-Day landing and the entire sort of conquering of Europe. And it was touch and go after they landed for a while. But the weather forecast piece was super interesting. And the play, that movie Pressure, well, you go ahead and ask your question because I'll go off on a whole other tangent here.
I'm really curious to know like what you thought of their approach at the time. I mean, granted, they don't have the technology we have now. They don't have the things we have now. They had to go, but working within the means of what they have, and you get the luxury of Monday morning quarterbacking. Would you have done anything differently?
Oh, I don't know. That's a very, very good question. I know even as a meteorologist in the Air Force, I had quite a few times where I had to make a forecast where I wasn't like even 51% sure that it was going to be right. So I don't know that I would have done anything differently or not. Maybe. I think I may be wrong here, but I think Crick was kind of an antagonist here. I think he was either more optimistic or more bullish. I can't remember, but the way that Crick was doing he was doing long range forecasts, and he was using something called an analog technique, which interestingly is how AI works today. And by an analog technique, it was, let's go back and look at all the records that we have for all the history we have. And let's pattern match. And let's see what happens whenever these kind of events happen. And that was sort of Crick's. He went to Caltech. He was a PhD, super smart guy. He was also a concert pianist. And, he was a very super interesting guy. I never met him. He had passed away before I joined the company. But that was his thing, was analogs. I don't think Stagg bought into that. And I guess we'll have to watch the movie to see how it all played out. I read the book a long time ago, but I can't remember all of the dynamics. But there were a lot of dynamics there, not just with Stagg and Eisenhower and the pressures that he had, but also with his own team and with Crick being kind of the gadfly in this whole thing. I can't tell you, I've had to make some really tough calls when I was in the Air Force, when I was stationed in Korea. I was stationed in Korea with an Army helicopter company. Their job was to fly along the DMZ in Korea, and they had something called corridors. There's these corridors all along the DMZ, and they had to fly their helicopter in just to maintain the presence of the U.S. And they also would fly dignitaries, and they would fly dignitaries up to the DMZ or up to Seoul, and they would fly. They still do fly nape of the earth. So they fly like through valleys and things like that. And, I was at an air base just south of Seoul. There were more air bases or more weather station locations up near the DMZ, but there's not weather station locations in valleys and things like that. And so there were many times where I would give them the weather they needed. And by that, they would need I need 1,000-foot ceilings and I need, a mile. And these pilots were awesome, but they were also very eager to do the mission. They didn't want to disappoint anybody. They wanted to be able to do it. And so they would put a lot of pressure on me. Just give me it, know. And I used to joke with them. I would say, well, they'd say, I need 1,000-foot ceiling and a mile visibility. And I'd say, oh, okay, I'll give you 1,001, but just be advised, that's my margin for error. So there was several times where they would have to land in like rice paddies because the weather closed in on them. So I felt a little bit of that pressure. I didn't feel the same, obviously, the kind of pressure that was that Stagg was feeling, or Eisenhower. He had famously handwritten a note that was going to go out in case the whole thing didn't work. It was a different era then. He was actually taking responsibility if his decision didn't go. So I can feel, which is why when the play Pressure was going on in London, I was really looking forward to seeing it. And my colleagues in the UK had bought me tickets, but my travel plans changed. I didn't get to see it. And I was thrilled just recently when I saw, oh crap, this is going to be a movie, because it was a hit play in London.
Yeah. Yeah. And so just to give some people some background, if they're going to go see the movie. So the idea is that obviously to land in Normandy, you have to cross the channel, right? So all of the troops were stationed at different points in England, and they launched them across the channel and have to head to Normandy. They have to get off the landing boats and onto the beaches, and then fight their way from the beaches up into the different towns around Calais and all those other places. And so walk me through, like, what are the weather, like, as both a military expert and a weather expert, like, what are the concerns that they had then, and what was it that they were trying to avoid, and what was it they were hoping for?
Oh, it's so complex. I mean, their wave heights are a problem. How high are the waves, because they're bringing maybe thousands.
These are like just glorified canoes, right? Like, I mean, these aren't very big boats at all, right?
Yeah.
So,
and then they had the wind requirements. The wind couldn't be above a certain level. Remember, the 101st and 82nd both dropped in. As at the start, the famous picture with Eisenhower, sort of with the 101st troops, before they got on planes and dropped into France. Ceiling heights. How high is the clouds above the skies to be able to support with air? Tides. The tide, which is part of the reason I picked the date, was because the tides would be just right. They would have the right. The moon would be at the right. I'm losing the word, the angle, but we'd have enough lunar brightness, and the weather for the date that they picked, the weather was just absolutely crap, and which is why the Germans were like, there's no way they're going to be able to do this. But that was when that forecast came out and said, hey, it looks like it's going to break, and we think we have this window to do it. And imagine if they were not able to do that, then they had to delay it another 4 weeks or whatever. Then the Germans would have basically, there would not have been that element of surprise, and it could have gone the wrong way. And maybe we'd be speaking German today if that didn't work.
So the toughest thing about that decision then was, waiting longer means the Germans have more time to build up. There's less element of surprise. Going sooner, but being wrong about the weather means some of these boats are going to capsize. These guys are not going to be able to make it to the beaches. We're going to have a smaller force because of all that. It could be catastrophic, and we could be repulsed from the beach. So,
correct.
Boy, it's a really tough thing to try to say, go as quickly as we can, but not into inclement weather. That would be a disaster. And that was what they had to get right in order to make that a success. Is that a fair statement?
Totally. I've actually got, if we have just a few minutes, I'll give you a real life war story. Yeah, I guess it is. Technically, it is a war story. This is when I was with the 101st on the border with Iraq. We had, of course, I was with the Division Main, and then we had 3 infantry brigades, where we had weather guys at all the infantry brigades and the aviation brigade. What the 101st did was, on the first day of the air assault, we went in about 40 to 60 miles, I can't remember the exact mileage, and took over an area, and it was called Forward Operating Base Cobra. The idea of that was to develop what they call a rearm and refuel area. It was like a leapfrog. So the initial group went in, and we had guys, some of my guys were on the helicopters going in. In fact, one of my guys was manning the helicopter manning the machine gun on one of the helicopters when they went in. So they went in, they took that over. And then the next wave came in, they landed, they refueled, and then they went up to the Euphrates River to block what they call, I think it was Highway 1. And the idea was, and that was, more than 100 miles inside of Iraq. And this is within 2 days of, the start of the war. The idea was they were blocking Highway 1. So the Iraqis, if they were going to send reinforcements down this highway, they'd turn the corner, and there would be the Stars and Bars from the 101st waiting for them. what ended up happening, and they did that. It was all good. But the guys got up there, and then not too long after they got up there, we had a massive sandstorm. They call them haboobs. And so all of a sudden, we had our guys sort of, at the very end of, or the very, deep inside Iraq, in the Euphrates River Valley. They had, a limited, I wouldn't say a limited amount. They had enough for the mission that they're doing of ammunition and beans and bullets, et cetera, et cetera. But when the storm hit, they were not able to sort of resupply them. So the problem that we had was, this is back at the Division Main, which is like on the Iraqi border. The forecast problem we had is, when is the weather going to clear? When is the wind's going to die down? The sandstorm will go away enough that we can land our helicopters in. But there was an additional problem, is that because they're in the Euphrates River Valley, we expected there was going to be fog setting up. So there's only a window of maybe 6 hours where the winds would die down, the sandstorm would come down, the visibility would clear enough to get our helicopters in there so they can basically rearm and reload before the fog that was going to set up there in the river valley there. Now, that wasn't the D-Day landing, but it was still like kind of a pucker factor moment for us, because at the end of the day, when you're forecasting the weather, especially when you're forecasting the weather with limited data, limited information, it wasn't like the Iraqis were giving us their weather forecasts. There's pressure. There's a lot of pressure. Now, I can only imagine what Stagg was going through, where he had the entire sort of Western civilization sitting on his shoulder. And, obviously Eisenhower was going to, take the blame, or, take the decision if it went wrong. But still, imagine if you were the person that had to sort of advise him, and they did not have all of the data, the technology, the things that we have now at all. I mean, it was like bear claws and stone knives, compared to what we have now. And yet they made that, ballsy decision. I don't know if I can say ballsy on your podcast, but I'll say it was.
You can
ballsy.
say ballsy. You can say anything you want on my podcast. It's totally fine, Paul.
Oh, the George Carlin. Okay, no.
Yeah, go for it. That'd be great. That'd be the first thing I put on social media. Yeah. So I want to ask one more question, and then I promise we'll wrap up. But when you had to make your Euphrates decision, right, and you were looking for this 6-hour window, it seems to me the trade-off is if you say go and there's fog over the Euphrates, or the sandstorm hasn't abated, the helicopters are going to have to turn back, right? They're not going to be able to get in there, and then they might have to, while they're refueling, the window might show up and then they will miss it or something. So that was kind of the trick, is just to try to find that window, and you don't have the data because you don't have any weather stations up there. So that seems like a very literal fog of war type situation. What did you do to make that decision and feel some confidence in it?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I was making myself. So there was a group of us that were doing it. Okay. But it was, and we had weather maps, but they came across on like HF, on these old fashioned fax machines, and it would be like HF radios that would give us these weather maps. And we had some very rudimentary satellite imagery that came from a system. It was called RASA. I don't even know why I remembered that, but we had satellites, but it was nothing like what we have today. It was very sort of fuzzy and black and whitish. So we just didn't, but we had our training. And so we understood, how the systems would, should flow through. We understood what would happen after dark, when it cooled down, we knew that the gradients would slacken the wind gradient, which is what's driving the wind, which was then driving the sandstorms. And the sandstorms are nasty. I mean, super nasty. And so you just went back to the basics. We plotted our own maps from the data that we would get, which was, again, it was sparse, but we would get some data. And it was, fog of war is right. And it wasn't just that they would have to turn back. There's a real risk if they get caught in that, because these pilots fly with night vision goggles on, and they're not flying with instruments. They're basically flying by looking at the ground. So and these were many, many, many helicopters. So there's a real risk of something catastrophic happening as part of it. So it was a tense moment.
Yeah, that sounds like some real pressure. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for an excellent episode. Thank you for helping us explore a really interesting facet of the world of content and how weather can affect consumer behavior and therefore what the impact on content is, and some incredible, very cool history about making decisions. And I loved it all. So, Paul, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach out and connect with you about your services and about G2 Weather Intelligence?
Well, as I mentioned before, www.g2weather, g2weather.com, not G2 Weather Intelligence, it's just g2weather.com.
G2weather.com.
And then
Got it.
just via email, if you can Paul Walsh at gmail.com, or and then or LinkedIn, or any of those sort of professional things that they do.
Great.
That are available for people to connect.
All right. Paul, thank you very much. This has been an excellent episode, and that's a wrap. Spring, fall, winter, summer. Which is your favorite season?
Spring. It's like rebirth. Things are coming back, and it just kind of gives, and I think consumers in general, we all sort of start to feel new energy when the leaves start coming out.
Favorite activity in the spring?
I guess getting outdoors. I think maybe just getting outside, maybe doing some yard work.
Beer, whiskey, wine, coffee, or tea?
I'm going to say coffee with beer is a close second, but I don't drink beer as much as I used to. I actually drink a lot of zero alcohol beer.
And you can drink it for breakfast.
There you go.
And not feel guilty.
You just took it to a new level. That's awesome. Your favorite state other than your home state?
I'm going to say California, because I grew up in California. I grew up in the Bay Area.
Okay. Favorite country other than your home country?
I'm going to say Switzerland. People are great. Everything's Swiss and clean and chocolate and cows, and I love it.
Do it yourself, i.e. DIY, or hire someone else?
Hire someone. 100%.
Yeah.
I'm not handy. My wife is very handy, but I'm not.